Every who down in Who Newville liked the holidays a ton. But where to get great prices on gifts, they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and no prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as Who's often do. Cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
When I went to Moscow and saw the sheer industry of Blunt, and Philby for that matter, they had day jobs. They were working late into the evening, and then late at night, they were spending 3 or 4 hours copying documents, writing personality profiles, producing information that they thought would be of value. They were not directed. They were self-directing. So all of this was an enormous burden on them. And they wrote reams and reams of this stuff. And you can only do that if you're a true believer.
Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior, and I'm delighted to welcome the legendary Nigel West onto the podcast. Nigel has been writing about intelligence and security for decades. He's met agents and double agents, defectors and super spies. His most celebrated books include The Crown Jewels, which was an insight into the KGB's huge collection of information leaked by the infamous Cambridge Five, and Venona, which uncovered the truth behind America's top secret cryptographic project. We've had some stellar guests in our first few months on air, including General David Petraeus, the former head of the CIA, and Helen Fry talking about the history of women in intelligence. So if you're new to us, check out our archives and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts for more of the best intelligence writing. We've got some incredible episodes planned. Don't miss out. But now I'll hand you over to me talking to Nigel about his latest book, Classified: The Adventures of a Molehunter, his extraordinary account of a lifetime uncovering secrets and lies. So Nigel, thank you so much for joining me on Spy Masters podcast. It's amazing to have you. We're here mainly to talk about your new book, Classified: Adventures of a Molehunter, which is the story of your extraordinary career ferreting out the secrets that people don't always want you to ferret out. Why did you write the book now? What prompted a retrospective look at your career?
I just thought it was a good moment. I had done a lot of work during lockdown, and at the end of lockdown, I was living in Kent, quite isolated, and I thought it was a good moment to try and record some of the stories before I've forgotten them. And I was also a little concerned about the way official histories were going, that the various different agencies had commissioned internal histories, authorized historians were being brought in to perpetuate what I perceived to be myths. Mm-hmm. And I was worried that there was going to be one version of intelligence history where there were people who clearly were making things up or had tried to justify past mistakes. And I strongly objected to that. And when eventually the GCHQ internal official history was published, this was something that David Omand, when I discussed this with him some years ago, said it could never happen. And when I read it and when I saw the account of a subject that I had a particular interest in, Venona, I realized that I had to speak out and I had to put on the record the true background to some of these operations before they were completely misrepresented. Not necessarily deliberately by these official historians, but they were just being drawn into an environment where the truth was not going to emerge.
I think I would like to talk later on about how one deals with the agencies when you're trying to write this kind of stuff, because obviously it's more complicated than in other areas of historical inquiry. But I did think when I was reading your book, and I picked up on how you felt about some of these official histories, that there are specific qualities that are kind of very necessary to make, I guess, a mole hunter, which is what you call yourself in the subtitle of the book. It seemed to me that you have to have quite a lot of tenacity, maybe a kind of bullishness and attention to detail. Do you think these are things that are necessary to kind of really probe under the surface of some of these stories?
Yes, I think that there are examples in the past of people being tenacious. It took me 12 years to find Garbo. It took Bill Steedman 15 years to track down Dick Ellis as a potential spy within the Secret Intelligence Service. So many of these investigations take a very long time. And I think that tenacity is one part of it. But the other part that should not be overlooked is that the skill of a mole hunter, in my opinion, is the ability to persuade people to talk and to be a good listener and not to cross-examine an individual, but to sit down with a glass of wine and chat. And I have never used tape recorders, and I've not taken notes. And that puts somebody at ease. And if you're swapping information rather than interrogating somebody, then I think you get better results. And over the years, I've met so many agents and double agents and case officers that I found very often a case officer would say to me, so what happened to Ivan? And I would say, oh, you'd never believe what, that he's running a monkey glands clinic in the Bahamas now, and he's injecting these rich women, American women, with elixirs that are going to make them live forever, or so they believe. And it's the swapping of information rather than cross-examining somebody and trying to catch people out.
Something that comes across very clearly in the book is just the sheer number of people that you've talked to, that you've interviewed, that you've met. I mean, you're very much not an ivory tower historian. You're out there talking, making connections, making networks.
Well, I think that that's absolutely essential. And I remember Michael Foote, MRD Foote, telling me that when he first accepted the commission to write the official history of SOE in France, there were two conditions which he accepted. One was he wasn't allowed to interview any agent. What? I mean, that's ridiculous. And secondly, he wasn't allowed to mention the Secret Intelligence Service. What? How can you write the history of SOE in France during the Second World War without discussing SIS? And of course, the rule within SOE was that when a circuit was compromised, like, for example, Overcloud in Brittany, that SOE was not allowed to run those communications. They weren't allowed to communicate with the enemy directly. As soon as a circuit went wrong, was penetrated by the enemy, they had to pass it over to SIS, because SIS understood about penetration, knew the tricks of the trade. They were professionals. They'd been at it for years. And so the idea that you can write a history of an organization that pretty much by and large by the end of 1943 was run by the Germans, but you couldn't talk about any of this, it's not history. And let me give you another example. Because Michael Foote wasn't allowed to talk to the agents, he got himself into terrible twists and muddles. Many of the SOE agents who were taken to the Avenue Foch interrogation center to be questioned by the Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst, the first person that they met, that they spoke to when they entered the building, was an SOE officer who said to them, the Germans know everything. Your best bet is to cooperate with them. Make a deal with them that if you betray everybody, they will treat them as prisoners of war and they won't be executed as spies, which of course the Germans would have been entitled to do. That officer was called John Starr. I mean, you won't find much about him in the books, but the fact is he could never come back to England at the end of the Second World War, and his brother was an SIS officer who spent his entire career trying to cover up his brother's misdeeds.
That's extraordinary. I do want to touch on later on this issue of the number of family members who work for these organisations, but we'll get there in a minute. When you started in this career, you describe a very different sort of environment where there was a big cultural deference towards the intelligence services, where nobody really ever expected to learn anything about them, that these people were treated as with sort of different criteria than other kind of political figures. And you trace in your book the way that that's changed over your lifetime doing this. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? Like, what was it like when you first started out in terms of the deference, and how did that change, and where do you see your role in that?
There is no doubt that deference played an enormous part, and there was also a culture. And the convention was that you do not ever name an intelligence officer. So about the first book that I read on the subject of intelligence was on the recommendation of an intelligence officer, and that was called the Venlo Incident. The Venlo Incident is full of Captain X, Major Y, Colonel Z. Names weren't known. And I realized just by reading the Venlo Incident that these people must have had extraordinary careers, fascinating tales for them to tell, and we don't know who they are. So I was always very keen to find out the true names of people, and where possible, to put them in the books that I ended up writing. So many of the complaints that are made about my books are that they're so detailed. I don't just mention that a particular building was in a particular city. I say what went on in each floor in the building in a particular street. So I've spent my life kicking against the deference theory, and very often these individuals, be they either case officers or double agents, are mad keen to talk about what they've done, just enchanted to reminisce. And the first book that I wrote about the security service, the secretary of the D-Notice Committee, who had already told me that there was no reason for me to submit my manuscript because I wasn't going to find out anything, eventually asked for 193 redactions and deletions. And we had a lot of fun over that. But I played the game. I agreed to remove an entire chapter about MI5 operations involving Ireland during the Second World War, because I thought at the height of the Troubles that was a reasonable thing to do. So the detail seems to me to be enormously important, and I was so fed up with reading books where people had fudged the names or the identities of particular players, especially when some of those people were willing to be found and talked to.
The details are crucial as well, it seems to me, because with the type of sources that you're working with and the type of archives that you're working with, sometimes it's the tiny details that seem to be the things that are able to lead you to the big scoops. And without a grasp of that detail, I don't see how you would have been able to find some of the people you found and do some of the things that you did.
Well, you mentioned declassified files and documents. That's entirely new. The reason why these files and documents are so important is that the word declassification didn't exist in the 70s and early 80s. But more importantly, there was never any expectation on the part of people who wrote these files that their material was ever going to be read by an outsider. So they were quite candid and frank in the files. I couldn't believe it I mean, we've lived in a golden age of disclosure because of declassification. 2 or 3 MI5 directors general who were historians by trade decided that the MI5 registry shouldn't be consigned to a bonfire, that it should be stored at Kew. And that has been a gold mine of material. But in the old days, there was no chance of that. In fact, it was a criminal offense to talk to these people. To name somebody was not only a potential breach of the Official Secrets Act, but there was civil litigation as well. So in parallel to the criminal dimension, you were risking breaching civil law, judge-made law, which is still in existence today, which says that a Crown employee has a responsibility to respect the privacy of their employer. And this breach of confidence was one of the major planks used to shut down and silence people. And beyond that, so you've got the Official Secrets Act, you've then got breach of confidence, which is judge-made law, and then on top of that, you've got all the other sanctions, including something that I'd never heard of, which I became a victim of, which was the public interest immunity certificate. So that where you just say, I'm going to fight this case, the Crown then comes and tells you that your defense cannot be adduced in court. And that's a pretty chilling. So the atmosphere at the beginning was really quite extraordinary. And if you'd said to me then, guess what? MI5 and SIS are going to produce centenary histories that are going to name hundreds of the staff, I would have called for the men in white coats.
But even in the beginning, then, you were having to walk a kind of tightrope between, on the one hand, needing cooperation at some level with the intelligence services in order to do anything at all, and on the other hand, kind of pushing as hard and as far as you could to be public in a way that they didn't want. So that's always been a tightrope for you as well as the official historians, hasn't it?
Yes. I think the really important thing was to have people on your side. So when I first tracked down and interviewed Harry Williamson, whose code name was Tate, he was a Nazi who parachuted into England in September 1940, I found him living in Watford. And I knocked on his door and I said, "Are you Wolf Schmidt?" And he said, "Come inside. None of my neighbors know I'm German." And he got this most terrible accent. But he put me in touch with his radio operator, and his radio operator put me in touch with the case officer who had run the case, and we became firm friends. One of the only photographs in the book of me, in fact, I think it's the only one, is with Tate, and that I spent the day with him and Russell Lee, who was his radio operator, and Tommy Robertson, who was his original case officer. And we spent the day trying to find the field that Tate had parachuted into. And we got there and we had a jolly lunch. But guess what? As a result of knowing Tommy Robertson over a period of years, he agreed, he wanted to write a preface to my book. He wanted to be innocuous, but he was going to talk about double agents and my role in reuniting case officers who sometimes hadn't seen or been in touch with their agents for 30 years. So I was putting some of these people together, and Stella Rimington wrote to Tommy Robertson and threatened an 84-year-old man with the loss of his pension on the grounds that he was breaking the Official Secrets Act and that he would lose his pension as a consequence. And when he said to Stella Rimington, "Look, it's innocuous what I've written, She said, you're giving credence, you're enhancing the status, the credibility of Nigel West, and it doesn't really matter what you say. The fact that you're making this contribution is the important issue. This is the very same woman who became Director General of the Security Service and subsequently wrote a book, a terrible book, called Open Secret, in which she described her own career in MI5. She omitted the role that she'd had, by the way, in threatening elderly retirees.
So what was the change within the MI5 that takes us from a situation where Stella Remington's threatening pensioners to a situation where she's publishing a memoir and it's approved and allowed and almost, and everything's been declassified? What changes?
I think the change was, first of all, it was quite good in the long view for the individual services. It enhanced their reputation. There is very little that emerges from the material that I've uncovered that reflects really badly on the British intelligence community or the individuals within it. I suppose disclosing SIS's operation codenamed Embarrass, which was the sabotage of the Jewish refugee ships after the end of the Second World War, when survivors of the Holocaust were trying to get to Israel in breach of the terms of the mandate. That was disagreeable, but one of the officers who had been directly involved in the placing of the limpet mine on the Pan Crescent, incidentally, nobody was injured in the ships were empty at the time that they were sabotaged. But when the Pan Crescent was attacked, it was attacked by David Smiley, who said to me that I could not only use his name, but when I was challenged about the veracity of Operation Embarrass, he absolutely agreed to go to the Observer and to tell them that my version of events was true. Mm. So I think that the intelligence community worked out that they behaved very well, that by and large these books reflect very well on the personnel and the ethics and the conduct of operations by successive British governments, and that they've got nothing really to fear from these kinds of these kind of unofficial disclosures.
In your book, you catalogue a number of cases where you and others are sort of challenging and pushing all the time, and things are being published in America that can't necessarily be published here. And obviously there was the furore around Peter Wright's book. So do you think that we just got to a stage where the intelligence community felt like the little boy putting his finger in the dike, like there's no point, this stuff is just coming out, so kind of constantly pretending that MI6 doesn't even exist is no longer a feasible strategy?
Well, can you name me another government department that has had as many books written about it as the Secret Intelligence Service? I mean, it's a curious paradox, but I don't think anybody's written about the Department of Work and Pensions. But SIS, I look around the walls of my study and I've got 400 books here on that very subject. So there's something going on.
Yeah, having once been a pensions journalist, I do understand why nobody's writing about the Department of Work and Pensions, but there we are. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is obviously you've met an incredible range of people, as we've talked about, but I was really interested by your comments on defectors on both sides of the divide. You say that they're just consistently unhappy, and that you've met the Soviet ones and you've met the Western ones who betrayed our side, and they're uniformly kind of unhappy people. I wonder if you could expand on that a little for me.
Well, I think I've always been fascinated by defectors because they really are very interesting people, because they are extraordinarily slippery. First of all, you can't believe their motives. They are very often narcissistic. They're mildly sociopathic. they can be quite manipulative. So the first issue, when I talk to a defector, is that I'd like to take them through their version of events and concentrate a little bit on their motivation. They never tell the truth. They will say to you, oh, it was the Prague Spring. So there I was in 1968, and I was horrified by the Warsaw Pact forces rolling into Prague. And that's when I had some kind of Damascene conversion, and I adopted democracy for the first time in my life. You then look at that defector in some detail, and you discover that he started cooperating with an adversarial intelligence agency, i.e. SIS, in the case that I'm thinking of. He was canoodling with his secretary, and his resident, a man I subsequently met in Moscow, had threatened him, had said, look, you've got to make up your mind. You've got to make up your mind. It's either your wife or your secretary, but you cannot continue this way, and it is going to ruin your career, and you're going to lose your job. And what happens at that stage, this individual, who has some other pressures in his private life as well, approaches the British and cooperates. So the motivation is sometimes very doubtful. On occasions, we won't even ask or press an individual about their motivation. So Vladimir Kozichkin, for example, was in an unhappy marriage. He just wanted to start again without his wife, who he really didn't like. And he told the British that he had hidden. So Kozichkin was a Line X illegal support officer in the Residentura in Tehran. And he claimed that after the 79 revolution, he had been told to photograph all the secret documents in the Residentura and hide them, and that he had lost a bunch of papers, and he had heard that there was an inspection going to be conducted from Moscow. Somebody was going to arrive and look at all of these secret papers, and he couldn't find them. And therefore, he had to defect really quickly. He'd been cooperating with the British for quite some time, but now he wanted out. The British didn't really believe him, but they had to. When he said, I want to defect and I got to come out quickly, they agreed to do that. And they never really challenged him afterwards about his motivation. And when I met him, he was still very enthusiastic about the Soviet Union. He wasn't a communist, actually. He'd always been slightly anti the regime. Oddly, for a KGB officer, professional KGB officer, he was also a drummer in a rock band in Moscow. And it was very hard to believe anything that he said in terms of motivation. And I came to the conclusion he just didn't like his wife. It was as simple as that. And that had happened with numerous other defectors. So you've got to slightly get under their skin and find out why it is that they defected. The Rezuns, for example, husband and wife, both GRU officers, now living in the UK, they defected because Vladimir had been given a job to do, which he had bungled. And he had 20 minutes. He went to his wife, who was also a GRU officer in Geneva, and said, we've got 20 minutes. I'm afraid that I'm going to defect. You can come with me or you can stay, but you've got 20 minutes to decide. And this meant never seeing their families again in the Soviet Union. It meant all sorts of potential problems, consequences for them. But they both defected 20 minutes later, and they showed up at an SIS station where it so happened that the station commander wasn't present. But their request for political asylum was accepted.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
So, if ideology is not a particularly strong motivating factor for Soviet defectors coming here, what about ideology in the opposite direction? Because in your book, you talk about, the three that you have spent most time with were Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross, George Blake, all of whom, there are question marks over their motivation and their ideological commitments. How far do you see ideology as motivating those who go the other way?
Let's take Anthony Blunt first of all, because I got to know him quite well, and I had the benefit of being able to look at his file in Moscow. And when I originally met Blunt and interviewed him at length, this was in 1981. I came to the conclusion that he was a very cold-blooded professional intelligence officer, as he saw it, who had switched sides and was now being as cooperative and as professional as he had been with the KGB. But when I went, and I assumed that was just it was intellectual arrogance that drove him, that he was cleverer than other people and that he could prove that he was cleverer, because even in the security service, where he was surrounded by some very clever people, he fooled them as well. So that was the view it was a mistaken view, as it turned out, because when I went to Moscow and saw the sheer industry of Blunt, and Philby for that matter, they had day jobs. They were working late into the evening, and then late at night, they were spending 3 or 4 hours copying documents, writing personality profiles, producing information that they thought would be of value. They were not directed. They were self-directing. So all of this was an enormous burden on them. And they wrote reams and reams of this stuff. And you can only do that if you're a true believer. Mm. And so Blunt, I changed my view. He was intellectually arrogant, but I felt at the end of it, I came to the conclusion that he was passionate. He started letters, "Dear Comrade," and signed them "Yours fraternally."
I found it quite interesting in your book, because broadly you don't foreground yourself at all in the book for a memoir. Your interest is in the stories that you're telling, not necessarily in yourself. But that was one bit where you're in the story, because you say that you were made physically unwell when you confronted Anthony Blunt's kind of cold-blooded treachery, and it had a sort of visceral impact on you.
Well, let me give you an example of that. One of the things that Blunt didn't tell me, that I subsequently discovered, was that in 1943, the minister in charge of MI5 was Duff Cooper. And Duff Cooper had a good lunch with the Prime Minister. And at the end of this lunch, the Prime Minister said to Duff Cooper, "Duff, what are you doing these days?" And Duff was quite surprised, and he said, "Well, Prime Minister, I'm a member of your war cabinet. I am the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster." There was a sort of long silence. And then the Prime Minister said, "Yes, Duff, but what do you actually do?" And he said, "Well, I'm in charge of MI5. I'm the minister responsible for the security service." There was another long silence. And then Churchill said, what does MI5 do? So Duff Cooper went back to MI5 on the Monday morning and spoke to the Director General, Sir David Petrie, and said the Prime Minister knows absolutely nothing about what MI5 does. He knows all about SIS because he gets briefed on a regular basis, or on a daily basis by SIS. He knows nothing about MI5. We must brief him. So Sir David Petrie then went to Guy Liddell, who was the director of B Division, and said, we need to brief on a monthly basis the Prime Minister. Guy Liddell said, this is quite impossible. He's an appallingly indiscreet gossip. We can't brief him. He'll just take the papers. So an arrangement was made whereby the Prime Minister would be briefed once a month by Sir David Petrie, who would hand over a document that Churchill was not allowed to keep, and that document would contain all the big secrets of what MI5 was up to. This is the important part. Guy Liddell chose his own personal assistant to write those reports, who was Anthony Blunt. So Blunt was going around all the most secret departments within the security service saying, I want to know what you're doing. I want to know your personnel. I want to know the true names of your agents. And he was putting some of this material in the monthly reports that went to the Prime Minister. But what shocked me was that when I was in Moscow looking at Blunt's file, I saw a letter to Blunt from a relatively senior MI5 officer saying, you have asked me to put together the true names and the details of every single one of our agents currently established in neutral diplomatic missions in London. We have never done this before. Please destroy this paper once you've read it. And there it was in Moscow. And so I found that absolutely chilling.
His justifications in his memoir, he talks a lot about being anti-fascist, as if that's a kind of get-out clause for everything that he did. And Cairncross does the same thing in his autobiography. This seems to be their sort of ideological catch-all, that as long as they were working as anti-fascists, anything they did that was pro-Stalinist could be excused. And I found that an interesting parallel between the two of them as a sort of ideological excuse for what they did.
Yes, I think that Blunt thought very deeply about what he was doing and had set out to do as much damage as possible. So he had recruited other people. He had talent spotted John Cairncross. He had not only recruited, but ran Leo Long, the spy in MI14. He was a one-man intelligence agency. And it's very important to understand the degree of his access. He was probably amongst the 10 most best-informed people in the world on the secret dimension to the clandestine war between 1940 and 1945. Mm-hmm. And it's only when you consider that you can also appreciate the conversation that he had with Guy Burgess at the end of 1943, when Blunt had decided that he wanted to go back to academic life. He had been offered 2 posts, one at Buckingham Palace and the other at the Courtauld Institute, and they could run together. But he realized that the Soviets would be very unlikely to let him leave MI5, where he'd also been offered permanent employment after the war, because he was going to, I beg your pardon, in 44, he had this conversation with Guy Burgess. And Burgess said, of course, I'll make representations on your behalf if it becomes necessary. Blunt told his Soviet case officer, I intend to go back to academic life next year. And there wasn't a squeak. from him. And it was Arthur Martin, who was the interrogator who got the confession from Anthony Blunt, who said, "What conclusion can you draw from that?" And Blunt said, quite obviously, the Soviets must have had another source in MI5, at least in a position as good as mine.
You make this point in the book, and also the fact that then in the subsequent post-war years, it was extraordinary that MI5 was either incompetent or devious in the fact that it didn't actually manage to apprehend anybody itself without kind of lots of help from Soviet defectors. So you talk about
we didn't get Soviet defectors.
No.
Between 1947 and Oleg Lialin in 1971, there weren't any.
Right, which leads to the suspicion that, you know, the Soviets knew that it wasn't safe to defect to MI5. So the problem is nobody's ever found any evidence of high-level penetration in MI5 after Blunt left. So where does that leave us? Is it still open case, do you think?
Blunt left in 1945. There is overwhelming evidence of hostile penetration of the security service until about September 1963. And the really important issue about Oleg Lialin and then subsequently Oleg Gordievsky was that if you can run a good case, and both cases were run, Gordievsky for a period of years, 12 years, Oleg Lialin 5 months, if you can run a case, then you're clean. You know that the case hasn't been betrayed. And Lialin was the first example of us being able to run a spy inside the KGB residentura in London. And that was very successful until Lialin was arrested in a drink drive episode, and he applied for political asylum. So between the period 45 and 63, the evidence is overwhelming of penetration. We didn't receive any defectors. The Americans received the defectors, and they all said the same thing. The Brits, we have gone there, but the Brits are penetrated. We never caught any spies on our own initiative. We tried to close down Venona. We refused to fully investigate some of the Venona spies in London, about which we know a great deal. And even in the past 5 years, MI5 has tampered with some of the evidence relating to Venona and penetration at high level in Whitehall during the Second World War, including people like JBS Haldane.
So our inability to work out or to prove one way or another where the penetration was between 45 and 63, do you think we're being misled by the official histories? Why, given the scale of everything else we do know, do we not know this bit, this missing piece of the puzzle?
Well, the blame does go partly to the official historians. I mean, let me give you an example. In December 1961, we got quite a lot of information from one particular KGB defector who was subsequently invited to come to the UK, look at MI5 files and give advice about penetration. And what is so extraordinary about this particular example is that we, the British government, gave him the CBE for the help that he provided. And he provided good information. And it resulted in several arrests, including a very important NATO spy and another very important spy who was arrested in October 1962 at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, who was in the Admiralty. So this particular source was an important, useful source who had proved his bona fides. And what does the official historian of MI5 say about him? That he was a deluded lunatic that has produced a whole lot of conspiracy theorists. This is somebody who proved himself to this country, and we rewarded him with a decoration the idea that in an official history he should be denigrated in that way seems to me to be quite extraordinary.
I mean, one of the problems with this as a discipline is that stepping into a kind of cloak and dagger world, there's always possibilities of compromise and being compromised yourself as a historian, aren't there? I mean, I know, so when you went and looked at the KGB files with Tsarev to produce the Crown Jewels, I know you came into criticism yourself, didn't you, for being a KGB patsy,
Yeah,
I guess.
Yes, yeah.
So does it work both ways? When you went into those KGB archives, how conscious were you that you were potentially being played too?
Oh, every second of the day I was conscious of it. But what would you do if you had the opportunity?
I would go. I would grasp it, of course.
You go to the KGB archives and you're in a room packed with documents that have been cleared for you to read. What would you do? Would you say, I'm worried that some of these documents might be a bit wonky? The reality is that if you look at the two books that came from those archives that I wrote with Zariev, nobody has been able to produce a single item that is untrue. Indeed, the irony of this is that I found so many SIS and MI5 documents in the Moscow archive that many of those didn't exist in England. When I started to produce Triplex, which was the second book based on secret British documents I'd found in Moscow, the Treasury solicitor said, we have a bit of a copyright issue here because you are reproducing British documents. And I said, that's great. Please bring a copyright action, because you would have to aver that the documents are authentic for you to pursue the copyright case. And he looked very glum at that. And he said, well, what we'll do is we'll compromise. If you don't say that you've got the British government's permission to publish this, we won't criticize them as being untrue.
It is absolutely insane that we have to go to the KGB archives to find SIS material.
And it's a great sadness that the SIS archives are in such poor shape, as indeed they are. And it was quite chilling for me to find, for example, the KGB file on John Cancross. And then when I was ghosting his memoirs, I realized at the end of it all that his version of events was a pack of lies, and that ended in tears. But the KGB archive had no reason to fabricate documents. And actually, my relationship with Zariev was really good, and he would tell me, so I had to tell him if the British government had asked for a particular passage or a particular name to be changed or redacted. And he told me where a particular code name had been changed or invented. And he most cases, he said, I have no idea why there is sensitivity about this code name. I don't know what the original code name was, but this code name has been changed. And so we acted together on a basis of trust.
I did wonder, reading through all your extraordinary achievements, what are the moments in your career that you're most proud of?
I think I'm most proud of finding Garber.
Yeah.
It took me 12 years to track him down. But I'm very proud of doing that. I'm very proud of taking him to Buckingham Palace in 1944. On 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings, for him to have an investiture and get his medal that had been given in 1944 in conditions of great secrecy. And there have been a couple of other. I was very proud to have helped Bill Casey when he was director of Central Intelligence. Those are the two that spring to mind particularly.
Mm. And just to finish off, you say in your book that the reason what you've done is so important is that we need to hold these agencies to account, and they're not always very good at holding themselves to account. Sounds like almost like a sort of self-appointed mission. Is that how you see it?
Well, when I was, during the period of time from the moment that I started writing about the Secret Intelligence Service and MI5 in particular, and today, we do have a parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee. We do have an external regulator who looks at the way warrants are issued and so on. And all of that has changed. But the incentive in the 70s and 80s was to get to a point where these organizations, which weren't even on a statutory footing in those days, it wasn't until 1989 that the Security Service Act was passed. Up until then, the authority was the royal prerogative. So it enhances the confidence of the staff and the people within the organizations that they don't have to whistle-blow by going to the media, that there are other avenues that are available for them. And that is, I think, good for morale, good for operational efficiency, and good for the long-term prospects of the organizations concerned.
Okay, wonderful. Well, on that note, Nigel, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. And I encourage everybody to run out and get your book. It's a fascinating read. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Remember, subscribe wherever you get your podcast for more incredible stories from the world of espionage. Come in from the cold with Spy Masters.